The big story is the college football playoff rankings, the second iteration of them coming out last night and causing a little bit of hand-wringing in the state of Michigan. Let's get to it as we roll our big story. Georgia and Bama remain 1-2. Michigan State's loss to Oregon, Michigan State's loss, I should say, means that Oregon, Ohio State, and Cincinnati all move up a spot. So Buckeyes are now in that all-important top four. The intrigue comes at 6 and 7, where Michigan's now ahead of Michigan State, despite the fact those two schools played 11 days ago and Michigan State won. The West getting some respect at the lower reaches of the poll. As you can see, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Iowa all in the top 20. First ever appearance, by the way, for the Boilermakers in the CFP rankings. 6 Big Ten teams in all. That is tied for the most with the SEC. So, as I mentioned, Fox Sports' Bruce Feldman is joining us to make sense of it all. Bruce, we'll get to Michigan and Michigan State in a minute. I want to put that aside because obviously for our viewers that is a really big deal. But aside from that, and aside from what it might tell us going forward, what else stood out to you from what we saw last night?
Honestly, Dave, if I was Luke Fickell, the Cincinnati coach, I'd probably be more annoyed at the rankings last night than Mel Tucker from Michigan State. Because I think what the rankings, the pattern seems to show from this committee is that they devalued head-to-head. And I think what this could be setting up or foreshadowing a little bit is, oh, Notre Dame, yeah, you Cincinnati, you beat them in South Bend. But, we think they're the more complete team. We think they played a more balanced schedule. Hey, did you see the teams that Purdue's beaten? Notre Dame beat them. It's that kind of thing. To me, that stood out. I also thought, Alabama's sitting there at number 2. Alabama was very lucky to survive against a LSU team with half a team that is now under 500. They got 6 yards total rushing in the game. It was at home. I mean, they're not a very strong number 2 at this point. I get it. They whipped Mississippi. But when you look at them, I mean, they did lose to Texas A&M. And I think what it shows is right now how much the committee has really propped up the SEC. And I think, the way it sets up right now, if Alabama beats Auburn and they lose close to Georgia in the SEC title game, I would not be surprised if a 2-loss Alabama team was put in the playoff based on how we've seen them get positioned. Like I said, they had their hands full with LSU, lucky to win. They had their hands full with Florida. We found out Florida stinks. So, I think they're kind of telling us a little bit about what they're thinking and what we may be able to expect from them long term as we get to Championship Saturday.
It is crazy, and I agree with you. I guess the flip side of it is once you get past Georgia, Bruce, everyone is so flawed. And I guess there's a part of me, I know that kind of the knee-jerk reaction, I'm not saying you're reacting in a knee-jerk manner, but is to say, why Alabama, they're so flawed. And you're right. I mean, you run for 6 yards against LSU, couldn't practice the week before because they don't have enough players. They have a fired coach. They're not any good. And yet you run for 6 yards against them. But I guess the flip side is it's hard to make arguments for many other of these teams also. And so maybe there is just this sense that it plays out. I do want to get into the Michigan State thing because, again, for our fans, it's fascinating. It does, I think, to your point, open up this whole other can of worms, a different way of looking at things. But what do you make of the fact that, I guess in their case, now we're 11 days removed. We were 10 days removed from that game yesterday. You put Michigan in front of Michigan State. Does it just speak to, hey, the game was in East Lansing. It was a close game. It came down to a few plays here or there, maybe some controversies with officiating, or is there more to it than that?
I honestly don't know. You could take the conspiracy route and go down to say, hey, they're really trying to devalue head-to-head. I mean, at the end of the day, they are telling us that losses don't matter that much, right? You see kind of a pattern of these things. I mean, this game didn't happen like September 2nd. It happened, as you said, 11 days ago. And, they said that Michigan's the more complete team. Okay, I looked at this last night. Statistically, Michigan has a statistically better defense than Michigan State, but they won the game. And by the way, it's not like Michigan has a bunch of great wins on the resume. They beat a Washington team in non-conference. Washington's horrible right now. So you just kind of look at it and go, okay, well, there's probably one really nice win they have. I think the reality on this is going to play out, right? Michigan State if they go on to keep winning, they beat Ohio State in Columbus, they're going to leapfrog whoever, right? I don't think it matters that much in the context of those two teams, but it's an interesting tell on how the committee thinks, the fact that they're just like, yeah, the game happened 11 days ago. We don't care.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. I don't think it really matters for Michigan and Michigan State because, to your point, if Michigan State wins out, if they win every game, they're going to the playoff, right? Because they would have beaten Penn State, they would have beaten Ohio State, they would have won the Big Ten championship game. They'll go. And then maybe Michigan goes as well. If Michigan were to win out, Michigan were to beat Ohio State too, right? Because, then you're looking at an Ohio State team with a couple of losses, and the tiebreaker becomes Michigan State head-to-head against Michigan. They go to the Big Ten championship game. So I hear what you're saying. I do think your next point is the biggest one, which is that it does allow them now to say, hey, Oregon, your schedule isn't as good down the stretch as Ohio State, and so now we believe if Ohio State ends up running the table and winning the Big Ten championship, that they could be ahead of Oregon even if Oregon wins out. To me, that is really the more global significance of Michigan State, as much as I know Spartan fans want to get bent out of shape about it.
Right. I mean, that's the context for me for Cincinnati, Notre Dame. I think that's definitely the context for Ohio State, Oregon. I mean, look, I barely graduated from junior college, much less went to law school. But you see how people set up precedent to point to. And I feel like they are starting to do that to be able to make at least arguments. Because I think at the end of the day, what's really sits in a lot of people's minds is who do we think is best when we have a whole body of work? And I think what they don't want to be in the position of is, well, you did it this way, so how do you undo it later? And I think that's some of the stuff that I think that the committee is forming. And I think Gary Barta, the chair, I mean, whoever's in that spot where they have to talk to Reese Davis, not because it's Reese Davis, obviously, but whoever has to, make those explanations, sometimes they're not positions that person may held in the committee, behind closed doors. But also I feel like, we're basically set up to be outraged by this. And that's fans, that's us in the media. And I think that's just kind of the flawed system we have.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I do think it's a really tough situation to be in. Obviously, I know and like Gary Barta a lot. And so it is, I think, for a lot of us in the media, it does become personal because kind of all these players involved. But we tend to parse the language of what they say in that interview like it's holy scripture, Bruce. And then, you look for all of these, like one word here or there or syntax. And then you say, well, how does that apply to this? And it's just someone responding to a question, responding in somewhat of an impromptu manner, even though obviously he knows going in, I'm going to be asked about Michigan and Michigan State. And so I do think it's a challenging position to be put in, because then everyone like you and me and everyone else is going to extrapolate it more broadly. But as you say, that's just the system. It's what we have, and maybe it's going to change here in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think it's just every week I come off of that Tuesday night going, I hate this show. It just kind of riles me up. It's like logic would tell us Michigan State, this is going to sort itself out. And I feel like there's a bunch of us who are kind of wired to think, well, we saw it on the field. That's the stuff that should matter. There's this isn't like the NBA or baseball where you have so many games and such a body of work. There isn't always that chance to actually, they played. And so I think based off of that, I feel like everything else kind of tumbles in a different direction. And so it's very good at getting people riled up. It does it to me, and I don't have a dog in the fight. If I was a Oregon fan, if I was a Cincinnati fan, if I was a Michigan State fan, I would be so ticked off by what I saw last night.
Bruce Feldman, great stuff. I hope you don't hate this show to the amount that, to the degree that you hate that one.
Dave, I'm the biggest fan going back to the days we were in Bristol together.
All right, my friend. Great to see you. Have a good weekend, and really appreciate you giving us some of your time.
Yeah, always. Thank you.
So that is Bruce Feldman from Fox Sports. Of course, you can see him this weekend on Fox. Another look at that top 10, including the best win for each team. Georgia is the only top 10 team with multiple wins over ranked foes. They pounded Auburn. As you can see, they beat Arkansas as well, which snuck in at the bottom of the rankings. We mentioned the Buckeyes. They have yet to beat a ranked team. We'll try to change that this week. Oregon and Cincinnati, the only top 10 teams to beat a ranked team on the road. The Ducks, of course, the win over Ohio State. The Bearcats with their win over Notre Dame. Anthony Herron is here. And Anthony, we're going to dive into the games again this weekend, but I'd be remiss if I did not give you your say. What do you make of particularly this Michigan State controversy? Because I think it's most germane for our viewers, but I also think it speaks to, as Bruce was saying, it speaks to Ohio State as well.
Can I address Cincinnati at some point as
well?
Yeah,
sure. Okay.
Should I go Michigan State first?
You know what?
The floor is yours.
Let's do Michigan State first, and then I do. Absolutely.
I think that, if I were on the committee, my vote, for lack of a better term, would have been to continue to have Michigan State ahead of Michigan. That being said, I do think there's a context for what the committee, I suppose, is looking to do. I just think they were inconsistent in how it was applied, because when you look at the game itself, and they've got Tyrone Willingham there, they've got Will Shields there, they've got John Urschel there. I mean, they've got football guys in the room, and I would imagine that not only them, but the committee as a whole probably watched that game, and as you and I discussed last week, still came away very impressed with the Michigan Wolverines, even in that defeat that they suffered on the road against Michigan State, a game that they had more total yards, they had far more passing yards, they had a big advantage in first downs and time of possession. It was a game that they controlled throughout, and then in the end, there was a furious comeback from the Spartans, and they earned that win at home. But I came away thinking, if they met on a neutral field, if they met at the Big House, that's a game Michigan would have won, because they were still very impressive in that. And so, yes, it's been less than 2 weeks since Michigan State took them down, but there still is the totality of their body of work, where there's still many advantages for the full resume and what Michigan's put on film and within some of the metrics that folks evaluate.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate what I said with Bruce, and I agree with everything you just said. I just don't think it matters, right? I mean, this is such an artificial system and a charade with the show, and it doesn't mean that I'm not interested in it. It doesn't mean that I don't love it, and it doesn't mean that I can't use it to try to figure out what's going to happen here down the road, but it doesn't matter, because Michigan and Michigan State both have the chance to play their way in. If either of those teams goes through the rest of the season and doesn't lose, they're going to be in the playoff. There's no doubt in my mind. So what does it matter?
There still is a scenario, though, where Michigan, if Michigan takes down Ohio State and Michigan State wins out but doesn't make the Big Ten championship game, then you could end up in a scenario where Michigan wins the Big Ten championship while Michigan State defeated them. Michigan State could be the Penn State of this year, when Penn State beat Ohio State, maybe, and the Buckeyes still end up making the college football playoff. Like, that is plausibly still on the table from a Michigan State perspective, and they and Michigan have the exact same teams remaining on their schedule. So I think, if nothing else, because they're only separated by one spot right now, it's not like they put Michigan State down at number 15 and said, we don't think you're good. They do have them one spot behind Michigan. They play the exact same final three teams here, so there certainly is an opportunity for Michigan State and Michigan to continue having their resumes compared side by side.
All right, say your piece on Cincinnati.
I have no tears to shed for Cincinnati. I know it makes me sound like an elitist or whatever. Yes, all the Bearcats can do is play the schedule that's in front of them. They did have the one magnificent game against Notre Dame. That's a great boost to their resume. It's the only boost available to their resume at the moment. And so I think people kind of try to have it both ways when they discuss the aspect of scheduling and strength of schedule and whether or not the group of five can end up making the college football playoff, because in Cincinnati's case, they're the best group of five team this season. It doesn't indicate they can't make the college football playoff. They're at number 5 right now. They got moved up after looking awful last week. So why are we so concerned with Cincinnati being at 5? If Oregon falters, they're going to be in. If Ohio State falters, maybe they'll be in if Michigan doesn't jump them. Like, Cincinnati is fine, man. There's not another group of 5 team that's been in as strong a position as Cincinnati right now. And still, when you look at the metrics, the rankings, I mean, their strength of schedule is 96. The record of the overall opponents they faced is 105th. That's with that paltry schedule that they play right now. So Cincinnati is in an outstanding position with their undefeated record. Yes, they need some help, but everybody needs help if you're not in the top 4.
I think where I really feel bad for them is what's happened with Indiana. Because Indiana, when they played them, I think Indiana was in a much different spot.
They were trying to do what they needed to do.
And the degree to which they have fallen apart has been damaging. I want to get into a couple games that will impact this college football playoff race in the Big Ten this weekend. You see the games. Ohio State-Purdue is clearly a really interesting one. The Boilermakers going into the shoe. We know the damage that they have done against top 5 teams. Now, technically, Ohio State is not in the top 5 in the AP. They're in the top 5 of the college football playoff. So I'm not sure if all of the success historically against the top 5 matters. But I will say this. Ohio State had a lot of trouble on defense at the beginning of the year. It feels like they have figured it out to a certain extent, although I'm curious what you think. And now we saw what Purdue did last week. We saw the degree to which they can throw the ball around the yard. How big a concern is that against an area that, at least early in the year, appeared to be Ohio State's weakness?
I'm wondering how Ohio State's secondary will end up trying to account for David Bell. And you know, I've told you about how deep I think Purdue is at receiver, and it had to be showcased at different points when David Bell got banged up, for instance, against Notre Dame, and then the preceding week after that also. But in the end, Aiden O'Connell and the level he played at, if we can get that version of Aiden O'Connell again from Purdue, then they can attack any defense, because we know Jeff Brom can scheme up the passing attack as well as anyone. And, you know, Purdue is one of probably 2 teams in the conference that I just say, you know what, don't worry about balance. Just kind of do what you do. It's kind of them when it comes down to it. And at this point, I'm putting Penn State in that same discussion. But the way they can air it out and the variety of weapons they have at receiver and tight end, I do expect that they're going to give Ohio State difficulty. In the end, it's going to end up hurting Ohio State's resume if they win, because Purdue will be bounced back out of the top 25. But it is a game that the Buckeyes should handle, even though defensively we've talked a lot about how stout Purdue is, especially in their front 7.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I thought of it when I saw Purdue up there as a chance for Ohio State to reinforce its resume, but you're right.
It's nice for now. You know,
maybe they keep him in at 25 like they did with Arkansas, right?
Just good win, not necessarily a top 25 win at that point.
What about Penn State and Michigan? You mentioned Penn State. I do think we're really at the point with Penn State, and I'd love to be proven wrong. Maybe at the end of the year here they figure it out, but I think we're at the point with Penn State where we just say they're not going to run the ball this year, or certainly not going to run it effectively. And so I think the question becomes, are they good enough in the one dimension where they are really good? And Sean Clifford clearly is healed and clearly is better, and he is a great receiver in Jahan Dotson. Are they good enough there to overcome the fact that they're not going to be able to get Michigan's defense off balance at all because they can't run it?
Right, and that's the unfortunate part. That's the difficult part, because I don't necessarily think that the overall structure of the passing attack for Penn State is quite in the same class with Purdue. But that being said, they're extremely productive because of a healthy Sean Clifford that we've seen throughout the season when he's looked healthy and played in that manner. Then, yes, he's been special as a guy who extends plays and has those strike play opportunities too. Jahan Dotson and Parker Washington and a variety of very talented tight ends. So to go in and perhaps be one-dimensional against Michigan, I think historically, we might look at it and say, well, that's too bad, because you got to, you know, sort of stand up to the test of Michigan wanting to bully you around. But frankly, that's part of what got Michigan State back into that game and ended up winning it for them, where Michigan shows up with the brass knuckles and they're thinking, let's get you in the octagon, and then the Spartans turn it into the Autobahn. And I think that's what Penn State has to do. They got to make sure they show up and say, we're going to play the game at our tempo. We're going to go for big plays on offense. We're going to have our blitz package rolling. There have been a couple of games where Brett Pry's gotten away from some of the blitz he used earlier in the year. I think get after Cade McNamara, see if you can get J.J. McCarthy to continue turning the football over and get your tempo rolling. That's their best opportunity.
It'll be interesting to see who plays for Michigan as well. I mean, they're really banged up, particularly at the skill positions, including, it seems, Cade McNamara perhaps a little bit. So if more of the game is on the shoulders of J.J. McCarthy, how will they fare? And again, these are games where they have not done well under Jim Harbaugh, 2-9 against ranked opponents on the road under the current.
Going to do a second wideout, maybe?
Coach.
They never do that, do they? They've already done their whiteout in State College. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's one whiteout a year.
Yeah, it's too bad.
I think there's some sort
Plan
of
another one.
Quota on those. Opening night of hoops last night. 11 teams in action. Shon Morris dropping by next, and I, for one, am excited. The 5-month journey to the national championship in college hoops started last night. 11 Big Ten teams tipped off their seasons. The highest profile game, that one there in the upper left, Michigan State losing by 13 to a very good Kansas team. Ohio State needed a last-second basket to survive Akron. The Mike Woodson era at Indiana, starting with a 6-point win over Eastern Michigan. Some other scores for you. Nebraska fell by 1 to Western Illinois. Iowa went over the century mark. We had 9 winners in all in the Big Ten last night. Shon Morris joins me now. Are there any sweeter words than Shon Morris joins me now?
Yeah, the train just ran over me. Something like that. I don't know.
Would you stop it?
Yeah.
Really great to see you. Let's start with Michigan State. And again, that was the highest profile game. The truth of the matter is, I don't think many people expected Michigan State to beat Kansas. You kind of look at this year and where Michigan State is slotted to be in the Big Ten. They may outperform it, but they're probably somewhere 5 or 6. Right. Kansas was ranked 3rd in the country. So the result isn't that surprising, but you still want to see, well, what's Michigan State about? Have they figured out the point guard spot? Have they cut back on the turnovers? Which apparently the answer is no. What stood out to you in watching that game?
We'll start with the positives. I thought A.J. Hoggard played a pretty good ball game. He's in much better shape. I think that was one thing that they wanted to emphasize with him, Dave, is getting in a little bit better shape because they knew they were going to have to rely on him a little bit more than they have in the past. You're also trying to incorporate a new guy in Tyson Walker. Now, he was an outstanding player at Northeastern, but you're talking about making a big leap in terms of the level of competition. He averaged 19 points per ball game. He got in there. You could tell that the game was a little bit faster for him. He had struggled with turnovers at Northeastern. That kind of carried over into this ball game. This is a team that's going to be fine. It would have been, obviously, a pretty big upset if they would have been able to beat the Kansas Jayhawks. You're talking about a team that really reloaded through the transfer portal. You know how they're going to play. Very, very talented. I think there were some positives they could take. Hoggard, I thought Marble off the bench gave them some good quality minutes. So they have some guys and some pieces that they can put together. But again, they're having to try to incorporate a new point guard with Rocket Watts going into the transfer portal a year ago and ending up at Mississippi State.
I agree with you. I think, to me, the biggest takeaways are Hoggard. I thought he was really, really good. I am still concerned. I mean, those two point guards had 6 turnovers between them. Hoggard still turned it over 3 times. Walker, to your point, maybe looked a little bit overwhelmed by the quality of the competition. So we will see. That's always a tough transition to make. And I think that's why it was remarkable last year, like Mike Smith, for instance, making it so seamlessly for Michigan. I mean, when you go from being the man at frankly, a low major, not even really a mid-major, to playing against the best players in America, that can be tough, no doubt. What do we make of Ohio State? I got to say, the backcourt production really concerned me yesterday. E.J. Liddell pretty much bailed him out, and Zed Key, of course, at the end.
Yeah, Zed Key, I liked him last year. He kind of was under the radar with all of the other younger players that were in the league. I thought he obviously delivered when they needed him. Liddell, a double-double. Everyone's talking about with Zed Key. They're not in that position if Liddell doesn't put up that double-double. Now, he almost became from hero to goat with that foul on the three-point shooter. This is a team that's going to come together. You know, they're going to defensively, I think they're going to come together and mesh a little bit. C.J. Walker, when he left, he was a guy that was kind of somebody that was able to keep things under control a little bit. I like where they're at. That's a scary game. I mean, if Chris Holtman scheduled that himself, he may want to reconsider.
Well, I think it was the connection with John Gross, right?
No question.
They went to the same, to Taylor, right? And with the former coach and whatnot.
And he coached, and Gross was an assistant at Ohio State. A lot of things made sense. But there's one thing about being a good neighbor. There's another thing about being a stupid neighbor, right? You don't want your neighbor to come over and eat everything and drink all your beverages.
Michie Johnson, Shamari Wheeler did not hit a field goal between them. And again, you think of how good their backcourt production was a year ago. It's a concern. Doesn't mean it can't get better. I mean, as I said, this is 5 months now. I mean, teams get better, and we know what a great coach Chris Holtman is. You at Indiana last night, you called it here on the network. Mike Woodson's debut as the head coach for the Hoosiers. They were in a battle against an Eastern Michigan team that is not expected to be a great MAC team, one that had a ton of turnovers. Stan Heath taking over as the head coach there. What did you take away from watching the Hoosiers?
As you know, I'm a glass half full guy.
Yes, you are.
So we'll start with the positives. I thought defensively, Indiana was really good. I mean, they showed you some things that you hadn't seen over the past few years, getting away from that kind of pack line defensive mentality that was in place. That it had its place, but there you could tell that ball pressure, getting up, communication, all those things were really on display. And that's why they were able to win the ball game, because offensively they struggled. They struggled from the foul line. That was an area of concern a season ago. That carried over into this opening game. They also struggled shooting the three ball. They were last in the conference and made threes a season ago, and they struggled in that regard. Another positive, however, Race Thompson. He's in better shape. A couple of blocks, ran the floor.
You could tell that Trace Jackson-Davis had also done some work in the offseason. He had a couple finishes with his right hand, ran the floor extremely well. So there's some things upon which they can build. But I think right now there's no question the defense is ahead of the offense for the Indiana Hoosiers, and they can kind of get things in motion. You could tell that they were not quite used to playing with one another, especially on the offensive end of the floor. Defensively, they were pretty solid. And the kid from Eastern Michigan, I mean, I give him credit. I mean, you miss your first 13, he's firing away, man, and he did.
I know, there was a period there I was wondering whether Eastern Michigan was going to score, and then it became a problem. Became a heck of a game. But you're right, 4 of 24 from three is concerning. But man, Race Thompson, yeah, he, especially on the defensive end, he really impacted that game. He was awfully impressive. Illinois and Purdue played kind of lower level competition. Illinois had 4 guys out for this game, so it's really hard to gauge other than the fact that they completely annihilated Jackson State. Purdue played a lower level opponent as well, but these are teams that are expected to compete at the very top of the league. Were you able to read anything into them?
I think the thing that I took from both of those games and both of those teams is the fact that these are probably, if they're not the 2 deepest teams, they're in the top 3 in terms of depth, and it was on full display. For Illinois, the fact that you had all those guys that you mentioned that weren't playing, it gave an opportunity for a Coleman Hawkins, who's kind of been bubbling under the surface. You know, you were able to watch them practice. You could see
Underwood loves him. He's been raving about him.
There's a lot of reasons, and he showed a lot of those reasons last night. And then DeMonte Williams really starting to become a little bit more confident on the offensive end of the floor. He had to last night. Defensively, he has just been stellar. He shot the 3-ball very, very efficiently a season ago. They have a lot of weapons, and defensively, they can kind of control the tempo. Purdue, very, very deep, very impressive. Edey just continues to just be a marvel. I mean, he's huge. He's like his own continent, and he can move. He can shoot foul shots. He can get up and down the floor. And I think the thing that what both of those teams have as the season unfolds, Dave, when you have that kind of depth, you're going to have the opportunity in practices to have guys push and get better. Edey is going to push Travion Williams to get better. And Matt Painter, to his credit, he will tell guys the truth. He's not going to tell them what they want to hear. He'll tell them the truth. And if they get beaten out, hey, go sit down. That makes everybody better, and I think that that's where their depth is going to really pay dividends for both of those squads as the season unfolds.
I marvel at the fact that Edey had 3 scholarship offers. I mean, it's 7-4. Like, what? He is remarkable. I thought Ethan Morton made some nice contributions last time. I mean, he had some health issues last year, and he was, you know, they had the 4 freshmen who all won Big Ten Freshman of the Week, and then, and by the way, there's this guy, Ethan Morton. And wow, like you can see he's a great facilitator. I mean, he'd be a really fun guy to play with, just given what a selfless type of player he is. So there's someone who we didn't even think about last year, and all of a sudden he's a good player.
And you know what, Dave, I was watching that game. You know, one name kind of came to mind, and it's not apt to make it completely right now, but Dakota Mathias. This is a guy that he knows how to play. Yeah. And the one thing with Morton that I noticed, he's going to get the ball in the place where the guy knows he can do something with it. The pass is here. It's not here.
Yeah.
And those are the little things that Matt Painter and every great coach understands. That's going to get him time on the floor. And again, he's going to push the other guys, because if you don't produce and if you don't defend, you're not going to play.
Real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about tonight's games. We have 2 here coming up on the Big Ten Network. We'll have Michigan and Penn State in action tonight. Micah Shrewsbury's debut. You're calling that game. Rutgers is playing tonight as well. What are you watching for?
Well, I think for Michigan, you know, the fact that they have Hunter Dickinson back is huge. I think maybe the biggest returner that people don't talk about in this league is Eli Brooks. With all the things that he does for Michigan, the production, the fact that he makes everybody better, I think that takes a team that has a lot of young pieces and makes them even more formidable. For Penn State, start of a new era there, a lot of new faces. Keep an eye on a guy named Jalen Pickett. He's a transfer in from Siena, was the player of the year in that conference a couple of seasons ago. They're going to have to play small. They don't have a whole lot of size. You have John Hara in the block. Outstanding. I mean, he maximizes his talent as much as anybody that we've seen in the league in the last 7 or 8 years, especially on the offensive glass. They'll need him out there because he doesn't have a whole lot of size behind him if he gets in foul trouble.
Looking forward to the call tonight. Great to have you back.
It's good to be
roaming the halls.
Oh, Dave, the only person happier with basketball season being underway than you.
I know where this is going.
That's exactly right. He's out of the house. Get him out.
Big Ten football Saturday. We have a double header on the network. It starts with Rutgers and Indiana at noon Eastern. Then Floyd of Rosedale on the line. 2 of the 4 teams that enter the day tied for first in the Big Ten West, going head-to-head. All starts at 10 Eastern with tailgate right here on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. And Floyd of Rosedale just gets mentioned, and Anthony just starts beaming with joy.
By Saturday, you should find out how much Floyd of Rosedale weighs. I think that'll be an interesting little tidbit.
I'm going to guess Floyd is, do you know the answer?
I don't, offhand.
I'm guessing he's right around 100 pounds.
I've nearly suffered at the hands of the weight of Floyd of Rosedale at one point in the past.
Yeah.
It's almost a very bad accident.
It's a much heavier than the Purdue cannon, the Purdue-Illinois cannon.
That was not quite as formidable.
Doesn't have quite the same heft as old Floyd did. But I mean, if it's a big, I think it's got to be big. It's got to be big. Yeah. What about this game? It is a huge game for both these teams. I mean, I'm sure that you could construct some sort of crazy scenarios where you lose this game and you still win the West. But I think for all intents and purposes, you got to win it to stay in that hunt. So what are you watching here?
I think especially because Iowa has already lost to Wisconsin and they've already lost to Purdue. And so when you get into tiebreaker scenarios, it feels like it means even more from the Hawkeyes' perspective because of that. Whereas Minnesota, you obviously want to be playing good football, but if Minnesota gets this one, they've got Wisconsin awaiting them. And so they're still, I would say from a tiebreaker perspective, in a stronger position going into the game than where Iowa is matchup-wise. But obviously, the quarterback storyline for the Hawkeyes is a big one because right now, Alex Padilla, he's expected to be the starter. That's what Kirk Ferentz has been talking about to the media there. And we'll see whether or not Spencer Petras ends up getting healthy anytime soon. But, it would seem indicative that Alex Padilla will be on the field. And he looked good, looked comfortable.
He did.
Playing against Northwestern.
First two drives, he was great.
Yeah. Yes. And they didn't necessarily ask him to take a lot of risks. What I did like that I saw from Padilla was even when they moved the pocket, he was willing to attack at times and try to get it downfield. I know you've been talking about Keegan Johnson for a long time, and they found a way. And some of it was just through Padilla not necessarily taking the dump off at times and trying to fire it down to him. So we'll see if that mentality ends up paying off in a game like this. But I was getting healthier up front on the offensive line. That was kind of one of the underrated storylines from the productivity we saw in the rushing attack. The interior of that O-line is getting better and better with Kyler Schott playing every snap against Northwestern for the first time all season. So it should pay dividends for Iowa's rushing attack, you would think, against what's been an excellent Minnesota defense.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how Minnesota bounces back. It felt like, man, such a great line of scrimmage team. They can run the ball. They can stop the run. They really couldn't do either against Illinois. And there is this notion of they're not really built to come back on people. And it just never felt like they had it in them to. It just, once Illinois went up 2 touchdowns, just kind of felt like the game was over, as crazy as it seems.
Right.
So,
it surprised me. It did, because I think from Minnesota's perspective, as well as they ran the football on a weekly basis, regardless of who was at running back, the way their offensive line held down that run game over and over again, I certainly didn't think we'd see the Illini stymied to the extent that they did. But I thought even if they did, like I talked about it on the tailgate show beforehand, if Illinois could get Minnesota into some predictable downs and distances, the Illini could rush the quarterback. They were able to get that done. I just thought we'd see more from Tanner Morgan. I thought we'd see more from that receiver core that's finally gotten healthy. So that it was probably the most surprising element of the game to me, that Tanner Morgan seemed like after a couple of games in a row where he was looking comfortable. It's not like they asked him to drop back and throw it 40 or 50 times like Sean Clifford has to do for Penn State, but I really thought he had gotten back to a point where they could count on him to make the needed plays, the necessary plays, even if there's not the volume to their passing attack. He seemed like he had things under control up until he faced the Illini.
And again, injuries have been a big part of their story. As we know, the running back seems like Chris Ottman-Bell's maybe not 100% of who we think he can be. We've seen some flashes of it this year. But, fascinated to see how they bounce back. Speaking of bouncing back, we got Michigan State taking on Maryland. And this feels like another game. I mean, I'm not – is Maryland Purdue's passing attack? Maybe not. I mean, I think they would be if all the receivers were healthy, frankly. But they're down 2 excellent starting receivers. But still, this feels like a game, Anthony, where if you're Michigan State with – literally in terms of yards per game allowed, which isn't the greatest measure of a pass defense, but by that measure, they're the worst in the country, right? And now you get a Maryland team that can chuck it around a bit.
They can. And Talia Tagovailoa, he's kind of getting back to looking like the guy he was starting to look like earlier in the season for a stretch, and that matters for him. It matters for Maryland because you want your quarterback now in the most extended playing time that Talia Tagovailoa has gotten at any point as a college football player. How does he respond? And we're starting to see him sort of come through the weeds a little bit, where there were several games in a row where he was turning it over too frequently, looked apprehensive, looked hesitant against some of these defenses around the conference. But there's been multiple games in a row where he's been more effective at protecting the football. And in addition to that, as he extends the play, he still has been able to find some safety valves out there. And there's plenty of talent and mobility in space for Maryland. And so this feels like a dangerous matchup to me from a Michigan State perspective because, not only just numerically, but I think it's legitimate to question their pass defense. They've been able to take it away on occasion. That's got to be the main goal for Maryland, is to make sure when you attack, you do so in a calculated manner. You can't just have Talia running around just trying to sling the ball up into the air, because this is a secondary that can make you pay for that.
We talked a lot coming into the year about Maryland and that offense last year, that they led the Big Ten, I should say, in turnovers per game. And it was a very limited sample, right? They only played 5 games last year, and penalties were an issue for them as well. I mean, they were right there. It was a tie game.
Right.
In the fourth quarter against Penn State. And
against a Penn State team that was playing pretty well.
Absolutely. Yeah, turnovers and penalties, they rear their ugly head again. And if you can avoid that, I mean, it does feel like they're right there. They got 3 games left. Yep. Can you beat Rutgers, or can you pull an upset here somewhere?
That's the thing. This game has, I think, a lot riding on it for Maryland because, between this game and what awaits on them next week, that last one against Rutgers, I don't think Maryland, you want to go into that game still needing one more to try and become bowl eligible, because Rutgers, of course, they're, I'd say, a team of similar stature in the Big Ten right now to where Maryland is. But for this one, though, Peyton Thorne, he was one of the most efficient passers in the entire country early in the season. He started to turn it over lately. He's got to make sure he protects the football, especially because of all the different looks you get from Maryland.
Yeah, he has not been great here. And they, the red zone's been an issue for them. They're turning the ball over a lot more than they were earlier in the year. So we shall see. Again, some interesting games there. How do they all stack up in Anthony's weekly power rankings? The Big Ant Impact 5. How about Michigan and Michigan State? Where does he have those two? It's interesting to see how the college football playoff rankings compare to the AP poll. Ohio State, the highest ranked Big Ten team in both. The AP has Michigan State ahead of Michigan, and as we have discussed, the playoff rankings flip-flop that. Purdue unranked in the AP, 19th in CFP. Wisconsin, which beat Iowa, is ahead of the Hawks in the CFP, but not in the AP.
Do you have to say it like that?
I'm just saying.
Which beat Iowa.
Well, I'm saying they beat them for the context of the rankings. I'm not saying like that somehow is a black mark on all of the players who ever played.
I see. I took it personally for a moment. I'm sorry. It did hurt my soul.
Yes.
The way you said that.
This is not meant to denigrate you in any way or any of your fine teammates. It was simply pointing out that one team beat another, and
it's
yet
accurate.
There's some.
It's accurate. They definitely did that on the field.
In the rankings. But the only rankings that really matter are Big Ant's Impact 5.
Yeah.
Patent pending.
Still.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's
get
into
paperwork.
Yes.
A lot of paperwork.
Let's get into it
on that.
Letterman style. Where are you going?
So, number 5, there was a team that was not ranked in the college football playoff rankings again. We addressed this last week with Penn State, and the case remains. I think Penn State being at number 5 in my Impact 5 is because, especially when you look at the way they've begun playing the last couple of weeks, yes, one of those in defeat, one of those in victory, but I think we're starting to see the Penn State that we saw earlier in the year again. And overall, for the Nittany Lions, yes, the Big Ten championship hopes that were there early in the season are no longer remaining, but spoiler isn't necessarily a role that a program with the heft of Penn State wants to play at this time of year, but they have those opportunities available to them really starting this week, man.
Yeah, pretty big game against Michigan. They get it at home, and going to be fascinating to see how that one plays out. Again, I'm really interested to see who's good to go for Michigan. I think injuries could play a huge role in that game, and one way or the other. I mean, it may turn out that everyone is healed up and ready for the Wolverines, but we shall see. Okay, so Penn State is at number 5. Who do you have at number 4?
If I'm remembering, this may be the first time since we've been doing my Impact 5 that the Wisconsin Badgers have actually made the list. But we'll
have to go to the archivist. We've got someone who studies all this.
Yes, we've got Don or Sebastian or someone to give them another job to do around here around set. But I do think that for Wisconsin, what we started to see from them matters quite a bit, because there was sort of this crisis of concept for the Badgers. And Madison. How do they want to operate? Can they trust Graham Mertz to really be a guy to sling it around the field? Defensively, the numbers looked awesome. They're keeping points off the board, but they weren't taking it away to support an offense that was ordinary at best for much of the season. Now we're seeing the Badgers ascend. And I mean, we may be talking a week or two from now where them being at number 4 may be an insult, because they are starting to look like the historic Badgers that we've been seeing for the last couple of decades. Now, they're a little banged up and short in the backfield also. That's going to matter quite a bit, and maybe it puts more on Graham Mertz than what he or the Badgers are comfortable with. But, man, the way that offensive line is playing, maybe it won't matter.
As long as Braylon Allen's healthy,
right.
I like their chances. Man, he is really something. Again, 270 rushing yards per game over the last 5 games.
Is he 18 yet? Is he
no,
like
I don't think.
15 years old, and he's like my size, just like running away from everyone and mowing people down?
He is still 17.
Man, very impressive.
Turns 18 a little bit later here in the next few months.
Like, I was 17 my true freshman year when I played, but for like a couple of weeks. Then I finally turned 18. I got my first facial hair. It was a big event. Everyone was very proud of me when it happened. But he's 17 for the bulk of this year, and everything he's done, man, he's a marvel.
Pretty impressive. So you've got Wisconsin there. Who do you have at number 3?
This is where we get into some of the discrepancies with where the college football playoff rankings
so this
sitting.
would be Michigan or Michigan State, right?
This would be Michigan or Michigan State.
They haven't popped up. There it is.
Yes, because it is, well, we'll call it Dick Clark style, maybe. It's the Spartans. And I think that because, when we think about what actually took place on the field, I laid this case out earlier just with the way comparing Michigan, the totality of their schedule, and what they're capable of at the moment. I love the fact that Michigan State went and earned that win, but I think by comparison to Michigan, who I have right ahead of them at number 2, but sticking with the Spartans for the moment, I think for Michigan State, they got to show me that they can be a little more stout defensively. That question mark that was there on that side of the football has begun to rear its head more and more. And like I referenced in the last segment, Peyton Thorne not protecting the football as well as he once did. So we're seeing a Spartan squad that's going to have to respond. That harsh glare of expectation being at number 3 in the playoff poll, I don't think it's necessarily about being nervous. I think you kind of tighten up a little bit sometimes. And it did seem to me like a team that played a little bit tighter against Purdue.
I'm going to be fascinated to see how they respond to their first real adversity this year and see what they do. But you're right. I mean, Thorne 5 interceptions last 3 games. It's just not rolling in the way that it was before. So interesting. So you essentially, were you on the committee? Would these have been your committee rankings too?
This is exactly what I would have done if I was in the room with everyone else there on the committee. So perhaps they are representing my same, I suppose, goals or aspirations for what the college football playoff rankings would be, because for the Wolverines, for the way they're so effective, especially up front on defense, between having Ojabo and Hutchinson, the way they can pressure the quarterback, that playmaking secondary that's so feisty and all over the field. And certainly offensively, we've seen growth from Michigan throughout the year. And where, like, from the Wisconsin perspective, I was talking about the growth that's there, the dominance of their rushing attack, and Graham Mertz looking a little better here in recent weeks. Michigan's been building in that manner for over a month at this point. And certainly the competition will continue to ramp up. The expectations will continue to raise for the Wolverines, but we've seen a team that's looking more and more capable of handling that. Certainly, when it gets to the toughest opponents, I'm going to count I'm going to count Penn State amongst really tough opponents, because this is a Nittany Lions squad that's more similar to the early season Penn State, a team that should, in my opinion, be in the college football playoff top 25. So this would be a nice test for them.
We know how things have gone this time of year as well for Jim Harbaugh. Just 2 games over 500 after November 1st. And again, part of that is the toughest games on Michigan's schedule are always towards the back. So that means Ohio State number 1 again.
It does. And, the Buckeyes, the resume overall, to be in the top 5 right now, there's a lot of eye test that's indicative of that. Still like what I'm seeing from an eye test perspective, but then also the way they're being tested right now, I'll be curious to see, can they ascend during the month of November? We talked throughout the month of October where they were starting to roll some folks and look comfortable in the way they were able to finish games. It certainly wasn't against the meat of their schedule. And so between the performance of C.J. Stroud, those wide receivers, man, are going to be tested this week in a way that they rarely are, because Purdue will invade your personal space. So we'll see how much of that, with that press coverage they do on the outside, are they going to be able to get off of that? And, if Garrett Wilson is able to be back or not, man, it's going to be a nice matchup they have on the back end.